Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's Monday, February 23rd, 2009, and I want to welcome you to the Future of Education interview series. We're certainly glad to have you here. Tonight our guest is Keith Kruger. Keith's the CEO of COSN, the Consortium for School Networking. And I'm going to introduce Keith in a minute or two, but first I want to take you through a little bit of the environment that you're in, the illuminated environment, so that you know what you can do here. At the top of the screen, you see an A, B, and C buttons. You're certainly welcome to push them now because we can clear them. But if we want to do any polling, we'll use those buttons to get responses. I'm going to push the A button to see an A shows up next to me. There are some other buttons also down at the bottom of your participant box. There is a hand with a green arrow up, and that would be raising your hand, and we'll ask you to do that when you want to take the microphone for a question. The smiley face indicates you're happy or laughter. The clapping hand indicates applause. The confused emoticon indicates confusion, and I'll come to your rescue. We won't be using the down arrow, the thumbs down tonight, but you know it's there. And so I can go clear those two columns. You'll see when I do. If you want to send a message in the chat room, there's in the middle of your screen at the bottom is an open box, and you type your message in there. And I'm just going to put type here, and you'll see I hit enter or I click the send button, and it appears in the chat. You can also send chats individually to others who are in the room, but do be aware that I end up seeing them all. Okay. If you look at the whiteboard, which is where the presentation is scrolling forward, you'll see that you have a number of different icons there. We're not going to use them during the presentation, but it is kind of fun to allow you to indicate on a map where you're listening from. So I'm going to give you all permissions to actually use that feature. And if you click on the little wand with the red star at the end, you can click on the map as to where you are. And then it's kind of fun if in the chat you actually put your name and location and maybe what the time and temperature are. It gives us an idea of where people are. We have someone from Australia, a few in Hawaii, it looks like Canada. There's a very big star in what might be the Caribbean. Folks from Denver, Phoenix, Rochester, Pennsylvania, cold and windy, snowing in Cleveland. Well, wherever you're from, we're sure glad to have you here. Okay, so I'm actually going to now take that permission away and move us forward one slide. So tonight, it's a great pleasure to have Keith Kruger here from COSN. Keith has not only been my boss for a few years, but someone I really respect and who I think does a really good job of helping to clarify some issues around educational technology. So welcome, Keith.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here. We were chatting just before this that it's a busy time of the year for us, and so I had agreed to do this a little late in the evening, thinking that it would be a calm day and I'd, be sitting here by our fire, thinking big thoughts. But in fact, I just rushed in from the office as we were settling down from a busy day of planning our conference. But Steve, do you want me to just start?
Yeah, that would be great. And whatever else you would like to say about yourself, please do so at this point. You probably hit the go to the very end button on this presentation, so I'm going to take us back to the beginning and scroll forward.
Right.
There you go. No worries. So it's just the single arrow there. It is good to know that you're actually in control. It's good to know that you're in control of the show.
But probably best that we not skip through all the slides. I talk a lot about technology. I talk about technology. I don't always do it. But anyway, what we're going to talk about tonight is, and I do hope that we can make this a little more interactive than just me talking. What I want to look at is what we sort of know about effective use of technology, and I've titled this "Learning to Change, Changing to Learn." And the reason I've done that is we'll show a little video at the end of the talk, which is kind of a student perspective of what they expect from a learning environment. For those of you who are not familiar with COSN, we're a 17-year-old national U.S.-based education association. Our mission is around the empowerment of what we call school district technology leaders, and it's really around their strategic use to improve the strategic use of technology to improve teaching and learning. And our core audience are the folks in charge of technology at a school district level. We generically call them Chief Technology Officers, although they have all kinds of different titles, whether it's CIO, as the Director of Technology, Coordinator of Technology. Of course, depending on the size of the district, those things vary. Tonight's presentation, I want to talk about three things, and I'm going to go kind of quickly through my slide deck, simply because we have so many people here, including some from around the world, and I do want to take the time to answer the questions that you have. But I at least want to briefly mention three things. Kind of, first of all, what do we know from the research around effectiveness of technology in education? And this is sort of a macro discussion. If we think back to high school or college, in our economics course, there was, of course, micro and macroeconomics, and macro is really looking at the big trends. So these trends may or may not be true in your specific school or school district, or even in the country in which, or the state you're in. But we're trying to look at what the big things are that are happening and try to see some patterns. Secondly, I thought folks tonight might be interested in sort of what's happening in terms of education technology, particularly since the election, and particularly in this last week since the passage of the economic stimulus bill in the United States. And finally, I want to briefly talk about what sort of some of the critical skills that I think we really need, both for those who are leaders of our education systems, by that people like principals and superintendents, but also for those folks who are in charge of technology, tech coordinators, directors, people who are trying to make sense out of these new tools. So what has been the impact of education technology around the world? And I will also mention the use of the term ICT. That's the global term for what we in the United States call EdTech. Stands for Information Communications Technology. Basically, it's the same thing. But if we want to look at the global research, they'll often refer to ICT. So, some of the bigger studies that have been done in recent years, and this next slide sort of summarizes some major studies dating back in 2003, quite a while ago, but done by UNESCO, part of the UN. They looked at 30 countries in South and East Asia and concluded that there was really very little impact of that technology in most of the countries in Asia. At least it wasn't showing up in terms of much impact in the classroom. A more recent study was done by the European SchoolNet. It was done in 2006. It found a little more favorable, some improvement in teaching and learning, but no fundamental change in the way that classroom practice was happening. And the European SchoolNet works with 29 ministries of education across Europe. Now some people may say, well, we ought to really look in countries that are very tech-oriented, and so we might want to look at an area, say the Nordic countries. There was a study that was put out in 2003, the e-learning Nordic study, and this, in fact, was a teacher survey. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. They asked teachers in 5 countries, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, to say, first of all, to self-report whether or not technology was having little impact, some impact, or great impact on their classroom and their practice of teaching. 70% of those teachers in these countries that we view as perhaps tech-oriented reported that it was really having either no or limited impact on teaching and learning. So that's pretty depressing, I guess, for those of us that think that technology might have a role. And I suppose it's late in the evening, and some of you might say, why in the world am I spending any time on this if that's the whole story? But I'm not sure that it is the whole story. And in fact, if we look at the research out of the United Kingdom, the UK has had a major focus on technology for the last decade, both under Prime Minister Tony Blair and now under Gordon Brown. The interesting thing is the last several years they've re-looked at their education reform strategy, and they've focused on personalizing instruction. And they've not specifically had a technology strategy, but in fact a school reform strategy, and that is that they found that all of the investment they've been making in technology and in education in general had some impact when they started a decade ago, but flattened out after a few years, and that they believe that the way that they could continue to see improvement in their school systems would be to focus on individualizing learning. This is a 4-year study that was done by their research agency, BECTA, which is similar to sort of a NSF-like agency in the UK. It specifically focuses on technology and education. So they came to 2 conclusions when they looked at the impact of technology. First of all, that personalized learning was, in fact, through technology, was the key route to educational improvement. Now, that's a very big statement from a research agency. And secondly, they went on to say that when you have a high level of technology, it dramatically improves student performance, so long as there was the right support, which I would argue is, in fact, the professional development, and the enthusiasm, which I would argue is the leadership to support and embrace it. So that's a little more positive, and let's turn our gaze now back to the United States. This is a meta study that was done. It means that they weren't doing any original research, but rather looking at all of the research that was out there on use of technology. And it was done by the Materi Group under a contract done for Cisco, and they came to 2 conclusions. The first one's, again, not so positive for people like me who see themselves as technology advocates, and that is that we've often overpromised the role of technology, that those who have promoted technology have often seen it as a silver bullet, that if we drop it within our schools, in our classrooms, that it will magically transform learning. And the evidence was quite clear that in isolation, technology dropped in the classroom, if that's all you do, does little to change the school environment. However, the study also went on to say that, in fact, when there's appropriate vision and adequate professional development, technology can be powerful and transformative. And it seems to me that that is the place that we want to be. That's the sort of role we want technology to play. I think we're also seeing that in most places in the world that isn't yet where we are, and that isn't where we are in most classrooms. I think the perspective in most classrooms, it sort of depends on whether we want to what perspective we want to take of where we are in the United States. If we take a teacher perspective, I think we have made some progress. Back 5 years ago, if we looked at surveys of teachers, only about 20 or 25% of teachers would say that they were somewhat advanced or very advanced in use of technology in the classroom. That has leapt forward to over 60%, even 2 years ago. I think if you ask teachers, do they have a belief that technology should be has a place in education, you get over 90% agreement from U.S. teachers. So there's a fundamental belief by teachers that it is an appropriate tool. Yet, I think if we look at how the usage of most technology is being used, it's still at a very early stage of what we might call Web 1.0 or early use of Internet in most classrooms, at least in the United States. It's certainly used as a communications device. It's certainly used to gather resources, to share email, to use email and gather resources to send students out to find things. But in most classrooms, we're not seeing a profoundly different use of technology. And if we shift our perspective to what I call the customer, and that is the student. Sometimes when I'm giving this presentation at conferences, I ask educators, who's the customer? And I often get puzzled looks. I get answers like parents or business community or the principal or the federal government or whatever. But it seems to me that the core customer of education needs to be students. It needs to be the learner. And if we look at, and we could spend a lot more time tonight talking about sort of a student perspective, but basically I think that the evidence is quite clear that the way in which the average school or classroom uses technology is quite disconnected from the typical way that students use technology outside of class. In fact, if we look at the Project Tomorrow surveys of students and summarized it all in one word by students, if you ask them how does use of technology compare with outside the school, the word lame is probably the way that most would describe it. And I have a few slides here just describing, I think you have already heard on this series from Julie Evans from Project Tomorrow, some of that disconnect where this is their latest survey that shows that half of students would like to use gaming. Very few teachers, administrators, and parents see that. Over half of students want to use mobile devices. Very few of school leaders think that's appropriate. Very few parents, less than half as students, want to have online learning. And very few parents, teachers, or school leaders want students to have access to school emails or IMing. Now, I think we can have an honest conversation about whether or not these tools are appropriate for a particular classroom or school. But the point of the fact is there's quite a disconnect between our customers and who the folks are that are delivering that educational system. Let me go back to that study that was from the Nordic countries. You'll recall this was the 5 Scandinavian countries. They asked teachers to self-report, was technology having no impact, moderate impact, or really positive impact in your classroom? And as I said, 70% of the teachers in those countries were saying no impact or moderate impact. Well, I think the interesting thing about this is if we dive a little deeper and see, is there some different way that teachers who are seeing really positive impact, the 30% that are, that they're using the technology? And in fact, I think there are some interesting patterns. In the no impact or moderate impact, those teachers said, well, they don't really use it in their pedagogy or for their subject content, whereas those seeing really high positive impact were. The low impact or moderate impact were not confident with technology. They were not using it much. Conversely, those that said it was making a difference really were confident and were highly using it. How they were using it was also different. They were not using it for collaboration in those low-impact teachers, whereas it was project-oriented, collaborative, and experimental in the high-impact teachers. And an interesting fact, I think, is that disproportionately teachers were at the secondary level who were not seeing much impact, whereas those that were seeing a really high impact were at the elementary level. My personal theory is that that's probably because at the elementary level they really are, they teach a number of subjects, they're more collaborative, team-oriented than in the average secondary school, but perhaps you have your own theories. I think the interesting thing about this survey, first of all, does this relate to, what you're seeing in your school or school district? There are a lot of free online surveys that you could, in fact, do a similar sort of survey of teachers in your institution, which I think is a great way to get a sense of, what impact are we really seeing today, and are there different ways that some of your teachers are using the technology? So my summary on this first part of what we're talking about tonight is I believe that in most classes around the world, we're not yet seeing technology as being integral to the overall education mission. It's being used kind of at the margins. And actually, that's not all that different from what we saw in the business sector. In the late 1980s, Robert Solow, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics, was interested in, if you think back to the late 1980s, business was starting to spend a lot of money giving every employee a PC. They were connecting them to wide area networks. And he wanted to know whether or not that investment was having any impact on productivity, profitability, or efficiency. And in the late 1980s, the research he looked at found, in fact, there was no impact. If there was any impact, it was negative because employees were being asked to do new things on top of what they were already doing. Now, the story could end there, but in fact, if you think back to the 1990s, we start to see a tremendous economic boom. And a lot of folks are saying, gee, maybe that's because of technology. The Internet is being invented, and we're starting to see that there's the use of computers. The Microsoft system is becoming ubiquitous across business. Maybe that standard operating system is helping business, or maybe it's because there's processing chips that Intel is making that give business the ability to collect data. So Solow goes back and looks at business and sees whether or not technology is the reason for this economic boom. And he comes to the conclusion that, in fact, technology has been a tremendous enabler of that transformation. But what the really important thing is that business was rethinking its business processes. And the classic example he gave was Walmart. Walmart was in the retail business, well before technology. It was about selling stuff. But what the technology enabled them to do, they did suddenly have large amounts of data. They could keep track of things. They could order things in a different way, deliver new products. They could micro-target many parts of their consumers to understand preferences. And suddenly they were able to serve better their customer base. And suddenly we started to see new businesses like in the book publishing business, where at any given moment in time, only about 20% of any book that were being published were available in bookstores. Well, new businesses like Amazon.com found that by serving what they call the long tail in business, that they were able to serve a larger number of customers, even if those customers were purchasing books that very few people wanted. They were able to look at that long tail. So it seems to me that what we want to think about in education is there some way of using technology for really big things? And that means we have to have a vision and clarity from our leaders about where we're trying to go. What are the really big educational problems we're trying to solve? And in a business like education, in an industry that's about learning, it seems to me that technology needs to, in the school environment, needs to be about how do we transform learning? How do we make a big difference in that teaching and learning space? COSIN represents the chief technology officers of school districts, and we often have asked them to rank, we'll give them a list of 20 different things that technology could do for education, and we ask them to rank them in order of what's most important. And interestingly enough, in recent years, the top 4 things that technology leaders have told us have all been really administrative things about the data. Now, you can certainly use the data to get to classroom performance, but it's interesting that so many of the top-ranked applications were, in fact, administrative. I think that's because the easiest way to show return on investment is on the administrative side. But if the core mission of our organizations is about learning, we really need to focus on the teaching and learning side. One of the things I think it's important to think about is, and these are sort of waves of technology, and it doesn't really matter what industry sector you're in. One of the first waves that we go through when we think about technology is, of course, the infrastructure. The first thing you have to have is the wires and the boxes or some way of devices and network in order to access the technology. And if we think of that in the K-12 space, that really dates back to the mid-90s where we start having the E-rate with the passage of the Telecommunications Act, and suddenly we go from only 1 out of 10 classrooms in the country having any access to quickly now having every school, nearly every classroom connected to the internet. But we quickly move into wave 2. That doesn't mean that wave 1 goes away, and in fact we continue in wave 1 to have to upgrade for broader bandwidth and things like that. But wave 2 is of course about what sort of applications we wanted to use, and we automate processes and we find better ways of applications. It's certainly essential, but it doesn't really change the traditional paradigm, and I think that's kind of been the wave we've been in. Under No Child Left Behind, there's been a lot of focus on professional development. In fact, any federal money, 25 cents of every dollar that's spent on technology must be spent on professional development. And in fact, when we look at how the money is actually being spent under Title IID, Enhancing Education Through Technology, almost over 40% of those funds are in fact spent on professional development. And I think that's why we see the needle moving from a teacher perspective from some of that data we saw before. But it seems to me where we are at a moment in history is in education we can start to think about the third wave, and those are transformative applications, where we think of technology not as one more vertical department within our schools or school districts, but rather how do we think horizontally? How do we enable the enterprise of education and embed it within everything that we're trying to do, whether that's the pedagogy, the teaching and learning, the professional development, the special ed, the administrative ways that we collect and use data, the way we do assessments. Suddenly it becomes vital to everything we do in terms of a 21st century learning environment. And those are the sort of questions that I think we need as leaders to be thinking about. So I said that I'd give a quick little update on sort of where we are today in the United States. I've already mentioned the E-rate. The E-rate continues to be one of the most important funding mechanisms for school technology in the United States. it's not a federal program, but when we as consumers pay our telephone bill, it goes into, a part of it goes into something called universal service, and universal service has been extended since the mid-1990s to cover schools and libraries, and it covers basic telephone service, telecommunications, internet access, as well as internal connections for the poorest of our schools. And I think we've turned a corner where a few years ago we still had very strong opposition from some quarters on Capitol Hill. That is no longer the case. We have pretty good bipartisan support in support of the E-rate. It is, however, capped at $2.25 billion a year. I suspect that we will be making the case over the coming months to the new administration that that cap, which has been in place since 1997, needs to be looked at and rethought about, especially if we want schools to have broadband. The other big program that exists, when No Child Left Behind was passed, it consolidated all of the other funding programs and competitive programs at the Department of Education under one program, the EETT program. And if you look at this chart, you can see that it was authorized for $1 billion a year. It's never been fully funded. The first 2 years of No Child Left Behind were funded at $700 million a year, dropped to about $500 million in 2005. In 2006, 7, 8, and 9, it's been pretty flat at about $270 million. There were repeated efforts by the previous administration to zero it out and eliminate it. So as folks know, there was an election this past fall, and the interesting thing is that President Obama has been spending quite a bit of time giving us a very big vision. This is a quote from January 8th, right before he became president. He did an address to the nation about the need for an economic stimulus. And you can read it, but it clearly says that to give our children the chance to live out their dreams in a world that's never been more competitive, we will equip tens of thousands of schools, community colleges, and public universities with 21st century classrooms, labs, and libraries. We'll provide new computers and new technology, new training for teachers so that students in China, in Chicago and Boston can compete with kids in Beijing for the high-tech, high-wage jobs of the future. So I think many of us were very, very optimistic. And in fact, COSIN, along with ISTE and the state directors of technology, proposed a $10 billion investment under the EETT program. The House and Senate passed $1 billion. However, a funny thing happened that they don't talk about in civics. You'll recall a week ago there was, in order to get the passage in the U.S. Senate, they needed the support. The Democrats needed support from the three Republican senators, Collins, Snow, and Specter. And to do that, they needed to make some cuts. So they went into conference committee. You'll recall that we had $1 billion in both the House and the Senate. In your civics textbook, that would mean that it's not a conferenceable item because there's no dispute. They were able to come to an agreement on a $787 billion package, $575 billion in spending, $212 billion of that in tax cuts. And a very large portion of that is, in fact, for education, $105 billion. Unfortunately, at the last minute, the $1 billion was cut by 35% and went back to $650 million. That's split over 2 years. So if you add that $325 million plus the level that we currently have, which is 270 or so million, it brings us almost back to the first years of No Child Left Behind. So we certainly have, I think we certainly were pleased to be in the economic stimulus. We were pleased by the vision that the President was speaking about. We were, I think, somewhat disappointed that we aren't even back to where we were 5 years ago in terms of the direct investment in technology under the economic stimulus bill. That said, I think this is the first act of a new administration that clearly supports this effort. We'll see what their budget looks like this coming week. I expect it to be a little bit above sort of where we've been, not much, a few $1 million. I would also say for those of you who are on the call not to be totally depressed because of the investment of the economic stimulus. If you're able to work with the folks in Title I or the folks with IDEA special education funding and persuade them that there's ways to spend their money using technology that might address what they're trying to address for disadvantaged or special needs kids, there is money there. I'd also ask that everyone on this call please go to edtechactionnetwork.org. One of the reasons that we lost 35% of the funding behind closed doors is Congress still thinks that there aren't enough people that care about this. We need to persuade them that there are. We have about 15,000 educators who have signed up at edtechactionnetwork.org. We alert them when decisions are being made, just like this latest decision. And in fact, we're asking folks right now to contact your members of Congress and tell them that we're disappointed that they cut this funding and they need to do better if we really want 21st century learning environments. This, in fact, shows you where the money is. It's a chart from the National Education Association. It shows all of that $105 billion. You can see that over half of it goes to stabilize state funding of education. What that means is the basic formula that comes from the states to school districts. Most of the money will go to that. We were hoping that some of the money would go for school modernization. Congress chose to put it in the State Stabilization Fund. It can be used for modernization if after you've replaced any cuts that have already taken place. So it sort of depends on what's happened already in your state. And you can see that student financial assistance, of course, is higher education. The ESEEA Title I is a very large $13 billion program, and special ed at $12 billion. Those are the big opportunities, I think, for technology. We're so small at $650 million, we're not even on this pie chart. Okay, I want to switch to the last part of what my talk is tonight, and hopefully we'll please do start putting in questions. I think the question is based on sort of the research that I talked about earlier. What are the essential skills for those that are in charge of our educational system, and what are those skills of those who are in charge of technology in our education system? And I like to always point out the critical role of leadership in school reform. This is from the research that the Wallace Foundation has done, and they point out that second only to classroom instruction, leadership is the most critical factor in terms of contributing to school reform. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is what do educational leaders and specifically superintendents think about technology and 21st century learning. And I would have to say that over our 17 years of existence, we have foolishly thought that if we created a mountain of resources for district technology leaders, including superintendents, that they would flock to us to find that. We never found that to be true with the average superintendent. And what we did find is that when we went to places where superintendents gathered, their state superintendent meetings, we heard very little conversation in the average state about technology. We were somewhat distressed about that, and this last year we decided that, maybe we ought to ask superintendents what they're really thinking about, and maybe there's a way to have a different conversation. And so we did a number of focus groups. We created an advisory group of superintendents, some of whom were tech-oriented, most of whom were not. And we asked the questions of, how has the world changed and what does that mean for education? What's the really big education problems you're trying to solve? And do you think there's some new tools that might address some of those really big problems that you're interested in? And out of that has become an initiative that we call Empowering the 21st Century Superintendent. What superintendents told us that they care about are these 5 issues. First of all, they're very interested in 21st century skills. They want to make sure that kids come out of education prepared for a world, and they think, in fact, that there may, in fact, be some new skills that kids need. They're also particularly interested in engaging learning environments. They're concerned that too many kids are dropping out. They're concerned that too many kids that are still in school are bored. They're also interested in professional development, the sense that the typical way that most school districts are doing professional development, after school or summer programs, are not very effective, and that what we really need to get to is a community of learners, a community of practice, where on more of a 24/7 basis, teachers who in fact are one of the most isolated white-collar professions can connect to their peers, or that principals or other administrators can connect to their peers. Again, the principal may be the only person in the building that has that job, or is that the only person that has that job. So how can we support him or her? The fourth thing that superintendents were interested in was their role. How is that changing? How can they use data to be more data driven? How can they communicate better to the public, to faculty, to students, to parents, to the media? And are there new tools to do that communication and analysis of sort of where they are? And finally, superintendents told us what they cared about, and in fact they would rank this at the top of the list if we put these in rank order, was they wanted to look at our assessment system, the sense that there was a great concern that we're not really having balanced assessments, that we're very focused on high-stakes, right-wrong answers, but we haven't yet really thought of new ways. Now, all of these 5 educational themes are educational problems, but I think that technology is embedded within each of them. And if we start a conversation about how do we create 21st century learning environments, well, I think technology is at the heart of that. If we want to talk about creating a new kind of professional development that's a community of learners, that's more 24/7, that's totally about technology. If we talk about what's engaging about learning environments, we just have to look at how kids use technology outside of classroom versus how they do within. Technology is embedded within each of these topics. For instance, this topic, these are a few slides, and we don't really, I know that we're starting to get some questions, so I'll go through these pretty quickly. these are some of the reasons that superintendents told us that they're interested in 21st century skills. The concern that students are not doing very well on international rankings. The concern that we're not preparing kids for what employers want. The concern that we don't have rigor in our STEM, our science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that we're not preparing kids for that. And that there are new skill sets that are not covered under No Child Left Behind. Here's a chart that shows the PISA rankings. In terms of the G8 countries, we're 7th in terms of ranking of math and problem solving. And when we look at the 30 industrialized nations, you can see the first bar is about our science rankings. In 2000, we were 15th, 14th in the world. We've dropped to 18th. In terms of reading, we've been flat. In terms of math, we've dropped from 18th to 21st. And problem solving, which was a new thing they started in 2003, we're at 21st. So that certainly gets the attention of policymakers. When we ask employers, this is some data from the conference board, which is made up of major employers. They ask them 3 questions. First of all, what skills are most important for job success when you hire a high school graduate? They said work ethic at the top of the list at 80%, collaboration, good communication, social responsibility, critical thinking and problem solving. Now, do we think that any of the high-stakes tests that we have, are any of those relating to the things that employers have just told us that are the greatest factors of success? When we ask employers of high school students that they've hired, what were their deficiencies? Written communication, leadership, work ethic, critical problem solving, self-direction. And when we ask employers of what skills do they think will be growing in importance, critical thinking at the top of the list, IT right behind it, health and wellness, collaboration, innovation, and personal financial responsibility. Now, I don't think that technology is at every single one of those answers, but or concerns that employers have, but they certainly have a lot to say about things like collaboration, things about the way that we do communication, the way that we do critical thinking, and clearly technology. So I see that someone wants to ask a question. Steve, do you want to allow people to answer questions now, or shall I continue?
Well, we can make that decision. Actually, that was Connie Weber accidentally raising her hand when she meant to be clapping. So the feedback was clapping.
Ah, okay.
But, here's what I would like to propose. Keith, typically we finish at about an hour. Your material is really good. I don't want you to shortcut it. Let's just say that anybody who wants to stay on, can we stay on an extra 10 minutes, Keith, so that you can answer questions? Do you have that time?
Sure.
Okay, so why don't you just go ahead and finish. Nobody should feel badly if they need to leave.
Okay.
We do promise an hour, but we'll stay on for a few more minutes afterwards to make sure that Keith can finish, and then I think there are a lot of people anxious to ask questions, so it'll be fun to get to that.
Okay, and one of the things that superintendents often say is, okay, I get it. I understand what 21st century skills are, but the problem is that the parents in my community don't want it. So this is an interesting study that was done by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. They wanted to know what voters thought about 21st century skills. And they asked them this question of, in fact, 99% of respondents by a survey by Peter Hart and Associates agreed that it was important to our country's future economic success that children learn 21st century skills, which they define in the question as computer and technology skills, critical thinking, self-direction, and communication skills. And of that 99%, 81% said it was very important to do that. In addition, 9 out of 10 voters agreed that 21st century skills need to be incorporated into the classroom. 88% said that these are important skills that schools can and should incorporate into curriculum. Another 10% said it was important, but not the responsibility of schools. So now, with superintendents, they often say, well, the loudest voices are those who want just basic skills. They don't want 21st century skills. They want basic skills. When the same survey said, what emphasis should schools put? Should they put it on basic skills? And you see that 25% of voters said that's where schools should put it on. Or should they put it only on 21st century schools? 21% of the public said that. Or should it be on an equal emphasis of both basic and 21st century skills, which is where the largest majority of the public is. That's 53%. What we like to point out is that a vast majority, 74% of the public, believes that there has to be at least an equal emphasis on 21st century skills and basic skills. So that's, I think, an eye-opener, often to superintendents. The last little point I want to make is switching to what skills the folks in charge of technology need to have. And this is, as I said, we're the Association of Chief Technology Officers. This is a graph that comes from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and it's looking at chief information officers across all industry sectors. And they argue that in 1990, the responsibility of a CIO in any industry sector, about 3/4 of the jobs, 76% of it, was all about the technology. There were small aspects in terms of business, leadership and management, organization and culture, and fiscal management. But if we look today at what the skills of someone at a cabinet level in any organization, any industry sector, we see a much more balance. The technology is still there, but it's decreased to about 20% of the job. The real focus of the job is, in fact, all those other areas: business, leadership and management, fiscal management, organization and culture. And we think that if we really want technology to start to be thought of as a strategic resource by school districts, they need to really start thinking about a new kind of person at the cabinet level. Just like 30 years ago, school districts started to create the chief financial officer. They certainly had bookkeepers, they had accountants, they continue to have those sort of folks, but at a certain point, almost every school district realized that they need a chief financial officer. We believe that school districts need to start thinking about technology and the need for a chief technology officer. And most of the folks on the call are probably familiar with the NET standards for students and teachers, and there are also NETs-A, which are for principals and superintendents. COSIN has been trying to define what are the essential skills for school district chief technology officers. These are our existing framework of 9 essential skills. We're just in the process of refreshing that. In fact, if you come to our conference, you can participate in a session where we'll be looking at updating and refreshing that to, in fact, increase the focus on sort of the educational role of the Chief Technology Officer. Oops, I'm sorry, I hit a little fast there. I did want to just, and again, I'd be happy to take any questions, so please start typing those into the chat box. I want to mention just some other resources that COSIN has available. We are doing some work with the MacArthur Foundation around use of Web 2.0 in education, but we're not specifically looking at the technology. Instead, we're focused on what's the leadership and policies that enable or inhibit adoption of new collaborative tools. And we're particularly interested in, we're doing a survey that we'll be releasing the results at our annual conference in Austin. We'll be looking at what superintendents, what heads of curriculum at a school district level, what we might call chief academic officers, and what chief technology officers know about Web 2.0? Are they using wikis, blogs, social networking sites, either professionally or personally? Do they see that there's an educational role? And if not, are they do they have concerns, and what are they around that? We'll also we also have a number of resources on helping school technology leaders budget for technology. Out of that has become an initiative on calculating the value of investment in technology. Steve has been helping us run our Open Technologies project, which is has a lot of great resources on it. We also have resources on data-driven decision-making and cybersecurity, and 3/4 of the school districts in our country have less than 2,500 students. And a lot of folks said, well, I'm the only person, or it's part of my responsibility, technology, but how in the world can I do all this? So we have a special resource to point how tech leaders in small school districts can apply these sort of things. And we have 2 new resources around green computing and IT crisis preparedness. I think we now have a couple of questions. Steve, is there any you particularly want me to focus on first?
No, if you see one there that you'd like to address, Keith, that's fine. If somebody would like to raise their hand and ask a question, we can actually give you the mic, or you can post the question in the chat area. And while you're doing so, Keith, I have a question for you. Do you think that these new participative technologies have changed our perception of the learner's role in this process of education? When you talked about the student being a customer, do you think that's reflective of this new world in which people really are learning on their own, and so we're viewing the role of student differently?
Well, I think that we should be, and that's certainly what the MacArthur Foundation is trying to fund. It's based upon the work of Dr. Henry Jenkins at MIT, work that he's been talking about for a long time about participatory culture. And I think that there is a very big concept here. Our current educational system is very much organized around individual achievement. And yet, if we look, for instance, in the world of science, it's very unlikely that anyone will win the Nobel Prize in science as an individual. It's almost all done collaboratively. And yet, our education system hasn't really tapped into the way that most research and, in fact, most of business works today. It is very collaborative. It is very working together as a team. And I think that requires a real thinking of how do we value that concept of participation, and how do we rethink what 21st century learning is. And it is, we're at a very early stage of it. I think we see obviously glimpses of what it can be in things like Wikipedia and others, but most of the really exciting things with participatory culture are happening in informal learning outside of the school. The early work of the MacArthur Foundation is funding work in museums and libraries and after-school programs. It's only now, as they're coming near their 5th year of funding things, that they're starting to think about formal education. And that's because they think that there's an awful lot of cultural conservativeness, and I'm not talking about political conservativeness, but the way that our education system is set up is not set up to be a particularly innovative and early adopter of technology. So we really have to make the case that there's something really important that happens around learning with these new collaborative tools. And I think it's a really exciting time, and certainly there's a great opportunity for bubble up, for innovative things in the classroom, for teachers that really want to try out new things. I also believe there has to be a strategy, which Kosin is talking about, which is the top-down. If we don't create a culture and a leadership and a vision, it stamps out that innovation in the long term among innovative teachers, and it's a long-term process. So I'm sorry for that long-winded answer, but I think we're at a very early stage of this.
Okay, great. So for those of you who may not have heard, we are going to go a little long tonight. Please don't feel badly if you have to leave. Everything is being recorded. You won't hurt anybody's feelings. We know we are at the hour, but Keith's agreed to spend another 10 or 15 minutes answering questions for as long as up to that point in time. I am going to forward the slides and want to make sure, Keith, that you get to make a pitch for the conference coming up. Maybe we can do that after Marha asks her question. And then for those of you who stick around, that we will be, there'll be a short survey on tonight's session, and so don't leave before you've had a chance to fill that out. Okay, so Marha, I've given you the mic. In order to speak, you push on the microphone button at the lower left underneath the participants column, and if you've got a mic, there you go. We heard you for a second, so do whatever you did again, and you can ask your question.
Okay. Well, my name is Martha, and I'm a first grade teacher here in Midlothian, Texas. And my question to Keith is, I'd like to know what conference the superintendents may have attended this past fall. Our superintendent came back, and he was very eager to be in the 21st century frame mind of things. We are very fortunate in my district to have that kind of leadership. And I'm just curious what conference he may have attended, because we are in the process of moving forward with Web 2.0 installation beginning this next school year, 2009-2010. And I will be serving on that committee to set the guidelines. So I think this would be a great webinar for him to listen to, and I'm just interested in if the conference that he may have attended may have sparked this interest.
Well, I don't know the conference that he attended, but I do know that we have partnered. When I said that COSIN had launched the Empowering the 21st Century Superintendent Initiative, we partnered with groups like TASA in Texas, with the State Superintendents Association, and at their conference in January, they invited us down there, and what we've been trying to facilitate is a safe conversation for superintendents to have with each other. Frankly, this is not intended to be the technology community telling superintendents what they're not doing right. Rather, we've tried to put this in the voice. We've listened to superintendents. We've allowed superintendents to present to other superintendents, and that gives it the credibility. And also, if it can be in an environment where the doors are closed and they're not embarrassed that they're in front of their faculty or in front of their school boards or their public, to say, I don't really know what a wiki or a blog is, or I don't really know, and that's okay. As what we like to say is, the superintendent doesn't need to be the tech director or the CTO. That's not their job. What they need to have is a clear vision of what can be, and they need to instill an environment that is innovative. And I'm thrilled to hear that your superintendent has gotten charged up about that. We need to model him or her. We need to take him or her on the road and talk to some others and hopefully reinvigorate a lot more superintendents to do that.
Great, thanks. Mr. Coley, I'm going to give you the mic. And again, the same thing, if you click on that button on the lower left of your participants under the audio teleconference box, you can actually ask your question out loud.
All right, thank you. My question is, in whole faculty group, we've been discussing new ways of teaching, but many of my fellow educators are only interested in using technology to do old things in new ways. And we've had a lot of comments in the chat room about how to break this spell, but I'm wondering what your recommendations are And also, where are some good beginning places for a novice?
Well, I think it's that part of that is, in fact, having discussions about the pedagogy. What is it that we're really trying to do? And I think we need to move beyond what I call the Best Buy conversation, which is, gee whiz, wow, the hottest new technology, we've got to try that, to really starting the conversation with what's the problem we're trying to solve. It is the big problem that kids are dropping out. Is the problem that kids aren't engaged? Is the problem that kids aren't getting particularly, we're not moving fast enough, or we're moving too fast for some kids. We need to individualize learning. I think if we get clear on what the problem is, then we can, as technology leaders, start thinking about what's the best tools to address that. Too often we start with the gee whiz, wow, and it's real easy to get sucked into that. If I want to have an overflow crowd of educators, I'll say, let's talk about the 5 hottest new technologies, and they'll be coming out the rafters. But what we really need to start with is what's the 5 big problems we're trying to solve, and what are the best tools that address those. I can't tell you what those are in every instance. I think that you need to have a discussion at your school level, hopefully, with the support of your principal, and hopefully you can maybe bring in some, some folks who are in your school or in other schools that are doing innovative things.
Okay, Keith, I'm going to pass the mic to Adina, and we're now at about 7 minutes past the hour. Shall we take 2 or 3 more questions, you think?
Sure.
To make this short, when we're having these conversations, or this conversation tonight, it kind of reminded me of a couple of things that have come up earlier today in NINGS and other places about administrators and those in leadership positions maybe not being part of these conversations in sort of a mainstream environment, that they're only hearing about them when they're specifically related to an ed tech point or in an ed tech conference. And I'm wondering how much the idea of technology integration in all its different areas is really being presented to administrators in a more mainstream way. For example, I was trying to help my former principal set up some RSS feeds or put some RSS feeds into her reader, and I was having a really hard time finding things that had to do with administrators. And I'm wondering how much they're actually getting in their regular things that they already attend and already read that relate to ed tech or technology integration.
Well, I don't think much, and I think that the secret of the success of what we are doing with superintendents, and I think it needs to be done for principals, is not trying to become a superintendent's association, but rather partnering with superintendent associations and saying, we really want you to look good. You get co-branded on these resources that we've created after listening to superintendents. We're available to help, present at your conference. And, we're very pleased to 10 state superintendent associations in California, Colorado, Texas, Michigan, North Carolina, Indiana, Maine, and probably some I'm forgetting about, all have endorsed our effort, and they've agreed to embed this professional development in their superintendent conferences. We also are working with AASA, the National Association. Just last week we were at the national conference. We'll be at their summer institute. I think that superintendents want to certainly be looking to the future. I think, though, when I was at a very large state superintendent's conference and we presented this, and the head of the association came up to me afterwards and said, we haven't for the last 5 years done a program on technology, because the last time we did, everyone left. They were talking about wires and boxes and standards, and all the superintendents left by lunchtime. We decided this was not something they cared about. I think that's because we haven't been having the right conversation with educational leaders. They don't need to know about all of the specifics of the technology. They need to, but you're right, they need to understand how it helps both their job as well as how it makes a difference in the teaching and learning, and they need to have a vision around it. And that's a conversation that isn't happening yet enough.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I'm going to give a little plug about the COSIN conference. For anyone who can get down to Austin, we'd love to have you. It's coming up in just, 2 weeks. And it's all about this topic of collaboration. John Tapscott, who you may recall wrote the book Growing Up Digital a decade ago, has written a new book called Growing Up Digital. He's revisited those kids who were in junior high a decade ago who are now out in the workforce, and he's looking at how they're working and living differently and what that means for education. We're closing the conference with Clayton Christensen and Michael Horn, the authors of Disrupting Class, how disruptive technologies, what impact they might have in the school environment. They particularly talk about virtual education. We do a pre-conference on our MacArthur work on leadership and leadership and policy around Web 2.0, and actually about 40 ministries of education and school networking organizations from around the world will be participating in that. So it's a great time if you're interested in what's happening outside of the United States. Sign up for it. And, we have just a real great program planned for folks, and it's not too late to sign up.
I think that's a great note to end on.
One last question?
No one raised their hand, and so rather than put everybody in a position of starting a new conversation, why don't we go ahead and close? I'm gonna hit the clapping icon for Keith. Keith, that's terrific. You did everything I hoped you would.
Thanks so much. And, we didn't show the video, but if you go to COSIN's website, www.cosn.org, the Learning to Change, Changing to Learn video, there's a new one up that we just put up this week with a student perspective. And it's about 4 minutes long. There's another version which we did, which has people like myself who are getting gray hair, leaders from around the world also talking about that was put up last March. So thanks for doing this, Steve. This is terrific.
Yeah, great job, Keith. Our thanks to KnowledgeWorks, who are funding the interview series, and to Illuminate for providing the room and supporting it. Illuminate does have a 3 for free program at vRoom, and please visit them if you're interested in using this technology. We're sure glad you're here. Coming up on this Thursday is John Palfrey, who wrote the book Born Digital, and that's with my PBS series. Then March 2nd, Gary Steger will be on, and Gary's always a lightning rod, which will be fun. And then I'm really excited about this on March 5th. Diana Kimball and Alex Levitt, who are 2 of the students who helped to work on Born Digital, will be on the Future of Education series. So again, our thanks to Keith. Please visit us at futureofeducation.com. Thanks to KnowledgeWorks and thanks to Illuminate. Have a great night, everybody, and we will put the recordings to the show up sometime tomorrow. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.